bury the hatchet, let bygones be bygones, kiss and make up. We have so many ways of describing forgiveness and yet so few strategies for actually achieving it. As some of you know, we're in a sermon series called The Love Languages of God, where we're exploring the last words of Jesus before he died. It's a great way to honor the Lenten season. And today, 3 simple but powerful words. Father, forgive them. It's not surprising that these words were first spoken from Jesus, from the cross. It's not unusual that Jesus would have uttered that prayer. But what's amazing is what he prayed. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I have to ask myself, as maybe you have too, is who is the them? The soldiers, the crowd, the religious leaders, you, me? Jesus' prayer gave voice to what Jesus was doing on the cross. He was offering himself as atonement. And in this moment, Jesus is both high priest, pleading for the reconciliation of the human race, and the offering itself. Catch that. Jesus is both high priest, pleading for reconciliation, and the offering itself. The sacrificial act was for those who had come before, and for those who would come after, just as much as it was for those who heard the words of Jesus that day. And Jesus wasn't merely pointing out sin as he struggled with great pain. He was praying for God's mercy toward those who had sinned against him. But what makes this prayer even more remarkable is that Jesus is praying for his tormentors at the very moment that they are in the act of tormenting him. Jesus is praying for them and for us before we even knew we had need of this grace. That's amazing. John Wesley would call that prevenient grace. You know, it's not so much what we've done or what's been done to us, but what we've done because of it. That's often the greatest grief. And you know, there's a lot that passes for forgiveness these days. But it's not forgiveness at all. Sometimes it's just a kind of indifference in which we dismiss people from our lives little by little until there's really nothing left between us at all. Because if we could remember what it's really like to be forgiven, how could we deprive anyone else of that same experience? It's not a matter of earning our forgiveness or letting others off the hook so that we'll be off the hook ourselves. It's really a matter of understanding that we've already been forgiven. That someone to whom we owe everything, life and breath, our blue eyes, your gifts, your talents, your pleasure for creation, the loves of your lives. That someone who has given and gotten precious little in return has examined our enormous debt in great detail and knows that there's little chance of anything in return, that the payment or repayment of that debt is pretty much nil. Someone who knows all of that has taken our stack of IOUs and torn them in two, balancing the books in one fell swoop. For one reason, and one reason only. And that's because that someone wants to remain in relationship with us and wants us to be free to respond. When someone like that has stopped keeping score, feels sort of foolish for us to keep score on the people in our own lives, doesn't it? I mean, let that sink in. Once we have really taken into our own heart the enormous gift, how can any of us pass up a single chance to do the same? Christianity can be built on isolating ourselves from evildoers and from sinners, creating a community of religious piety and moral purity. That's the Christianity I grew up with. But Christianity can also be built around joining with the brokenhearted, the sinners, and crying out to God and groaning for grace. That's the kind of Christianity I've fallen in love with. You just can't get away from Jesus' love for evildoers. I mean, everywhere you look and read in the Bible, Jesus is reminding us of that. So when it comes to the world's logic of redemption, Christians have a major stumbling block on their hands, namely the cross. I mean, the truth is that if we really have to lose our lives in order to find them, that just doesn't sound like a great plan for national security, does it? And as old troubadour Woody Guthrie sings, if Jesus preached in New York what Jesus preached in Galilee, we'd lay him in the grave again, especially if he did it on Wall Street. I guess that's why we hear a lot about God's blessing. And I'll be honest, I struggle with those bumper stickers, God bless America, because my friends, God certainly has. We hear a lot about asking God to expand our territory, but very little about a cross and a love for our enemies. I mean, we don't even want strangers crossing our borders, for goodness sake. There comes a point where we recognize that we're trying to serve two masters. And we have to choose which one we're going to serve, because, my friends, our arms just are not big enough to carry the cross and the sword. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. What kind of love does that? Rich Mullins, Christian musician who I love, most of you would know him by his song, Awesome God. He died in 1987, but he used to tell the story from the Old Testament, speaking about Balaam. And he'd say, you know, God spoke to Balaam through his donkey, and God's been speaking through them ever since. He might have used another word. But if God chose to use us, and I believe God did, then we shouldn't think too highly of ourselves that God can't use someone else. There's a youth director that I know and I love who told me a story about a trip he took with a bunch of teenagers to one of those mountaintop retreats. You know, the ones with lots of tears and confessions and spiritual goosebumps. On the way up, the van had a flat tire of the worst kind. And it was raining, no tools, bad spare. And all the kids just stared out the window. And as he worked, nothing went right. And he said, to be honest, my temper just escalated. And I kind of just went beyond the tipping point, Meg, and I lost it. I started yelling, started kicking the tire, a few cuss words slipped out. Well, after his little temper tantrum, he finally did get the tire back on the bus, so to speak, and climbed into the driver's seat, told everybody to be quiet. He needed a moment. He was a little embarrassed. And they went on. Just a few snickers from the back of the van. He said the retreat was the same as it was every year. You know, nothing unusual happened. good worship, good singing, altar calls. But something interesting happened about a week later. One of his toughest kids came to him that had been on that retreat, and he told him that he'd given his life to Jesus. And my friend was a bit stunned and asked him to explain what happened. He said, was it the message? Was it the altar call? The young man said, no. No, it was on the way up when I saw you cussing at the van. I thought to myself, if he can be a Christian, I can give this thing a shot too. There are so many people who are longing to be brought to life, who know all too well that they've done evil, who long to hear that there is not only a God who will embrace evildoers, but a church that will do the same. You see, the unselfish generosity of forgiveness, it is a myth. Forgiveness is more important to the one who forgives than the one who is forgiven. Because forgiveness puts life back together. It's a sign of our own inner healing. It's the measure of the divine in us. Can you hear that? It's the measure of the divine in us. And it's our forgiveness of others that gains for us the right to forgive ourselves for being less than we always wanted to be. Jesus used all his resources to offer grace. Even on the cross, in the midst of great suffering, as his body is shutting down in death, Jesus uses what he has, his words. 7 statements we have from the cross, his last human gift to us. And what Jesus wanted us to know is that we are forgiven. The focus of the gospel is not so much that we are sinners. The focus of the gospel is that God, through Christ, is Savior. The grace of God, the undeserved favor of God, the grace that goes before us. Love is a choice. Ever since I was a child, hearing the stories of the gospel of Jesus, Jesus' death and his resurrection, I must confess I never really thought about his scars. Now, sure, I know he had them. I know that Thomas said he would never believe unless he could put his hands in Jesus' scars. I knew all of that. But the fact of the matter is that Jesus was never really interested in proving who he was. Not to the Pharisees, not to his followers, certainly not to Pilate or Caiaphas or Annas, not even to the 2 men who died beside him that day. So why, in a perfectly resurrected body, did Jesus keep his scars? Well, I think maybe after spending a week in Guatemala just last week, I found some insight into scars. This is Adonis, fitting name for a strikingly handsome man. And I met Adonis in the pre-op room of the Obras, the hospital where the surgery teams worked. Adonis is waiting for a scar revision. You know, all scars tell a story. You see, Adonis was traveling home from work on Christmas Day this past year, and his motorcycle collided with an ambulance, resulting in a catastrophic wound. His face was sewn up pretty poorly. It started at his scalp and went through his eye and down his cheek. And it had been months since Adonis could even close his eye. He was withdrawn and quiet and apprehensive, yet really hopeful. And the day after surgery, I had the opportunity to visit with Adonis and his family and to hear a bit of his story. That's his mom and his dad, and that's Victor, my translator. And his mom, through her tears, told me that Adonis never left the house, not since the accident, that he was depressed and ashamed of his scarred face, that Adonis was consumed by what he had lost. And Adonis just looked down at the tile on the floor. And so I knelt down beside Adonis, and I stared into his eyes for several minutes before he raised his eyes and looked into mine. And then I honestly believe that God gave me these words to say to him. I said, Adonis, our scars tell where we've been. Our scars even tell what's happened to us. But our scars do not tell who we are. Yesterday, your scar told a story of pain and suffering. But Adonis, today, your scars tell about healing and hope. Maybe that's why Jesus kept his scars. They didn't define him. But even today, they remind us of where he's been. To hell and back. For you and for me. What do your scars say about you? Are they just about pain and brokenness? Or are they a symbol of hope and healing? We cannot protect ourselves from suffering and from loss. It's just the world we live in. It comes with this flesh and blood and this place where we walk. But we can trust that when our lives are ripped open from pain or betrayal or some uninvited circumstance, that the master surgeon will carefully and meticulously stitch us up. And the faint scars that are left behind, by the grace of God, will be a fine line, a reminder of healing that comes with our story, that shapes our future but does not define it. How the story plays out, well, that's up to us. May we have the courage to walk the way of Jesus, to take the pain that has been given, to give thanks for it, and to transform it into the forgiveness that fills the emptiness. I've glimpsed it, the hard discipline to lean into the ugly and whisper thanks to transfigure it into beauty. The intentional discipline of working through the scar tissue, well, the beauty of that is that we just heal ourselves in the process. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. How grateful I am for a Savior who prays that on my behalf. How grateful are we all? Words of grace and words of peace to bind up our wounds, to offer our hand to another, to let someone in your life who is hurting off the hook. Because the truth is, we've all heard enough, right? Could we have the courage to offer that grace to someone else. God, let it be so.